This is a true story of a war that never truly ended, not on battlefields, but in courtrooms, archives, and the quiet desperation of families seeking what was stolen from them. In the 1990s, more than 50 years after the Holocaust, a Swiss bank employee named Christoph Meili walked into a shredding room and found documents marked for destruction, records of Jewish accounts that had been dormant since the war. His decision to blow the whistle would expose one of the largest financial cover-ups in history and reignite a battle for justice that survivors thought had been lost forever. What you're about to hear is the story of Nazi gold that disappeared into bank vaults, art that hung in museums for decades while families searched, and legal fights that dragged on so long that most victims never lived to see their names cleared. This is the story of late justice, and the uncomfortable question of whether money, no matter how much, can ever make the past right. The silence after the war. When World War II ended in 1945, the world wanted to move on. Cities had to be rebuilt, refugees had to be resettled, the living had to bury the dead and try to start again. But for hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors, those who had lost everything except their lives, there was no moving on. Their homes had been confiscated, their businesses had been seized, their bank accounts had been frozen or looted. Their family heirlooms, jewelry, and art had been stolen by the Nazis or sold under duress to pay for exit visas, bribes, or survival. In the chaos of post-war Europe, the systems that might have helped them reclaim these assets simply didn't exist or didn't care. Borders had shifted. Governments had changed. Records had been destroyed in bombings, fires, or deliberate purges. Banks claimed they had no documentation. Museums said their acquisitions were legitimate. Insurance companies declared that policies had lapsed or that heirs couldn't prove ownership. And so, quietly, the theft continued. Not through violence this time, but through bureaucracy, silence, and the passage of time. Imagine you're a survivor. You escaped a camp, lost your entire family, and made it to America or Israel with nothing. You remember your father had a bank account in Switzerland. He showed you the passbook once, years before the war. You write to the bank. They respond, "We have no record of such an account. Provide documentation." But the documentation was in your home, which was burned. Your father, who could have verified the account, was murdered in Auschwitz. The bank offers nothing, no apology, no investigation, just a polite letter saying the matter is closed. This happened thousands of times, and for decades it stayed buried. The Swiss bank scandal breaks open. Switzerland had been neutral during the war, officially. In practice, Swiss banks had done business with the Nazis, accepted looted gold, and managed accounts for Jewish clients who never returned to claim them. After the war, these banks insisted they were bound by strict secrecy laws and couldn't release information about dormant accounts without proper documentation and proof of death. But survivors didn't have death certificates for relatives killed in gas chambers. They didn't have account numbers memorized. They didn't have the legal resources to fight billion-dollar banks in Swiss courts. So the banks kept the money. And for 50 years, almost no one challenged them. Then in January 1997, a night watchman named Christoph Meili was doing his rounds at Union Bank of Switzerland, now UBS, in Zurich. He passed the shredding room and noticed large piles of old documents being prepared for destruction. Curious, he looked closer. The papers were ledgers, account files, and property records, some dating back to the 1930s and 1940s. Many were marked with Jewish names. Meili knew what he was seeing. He knew these documents were supposed to be preserved under a recent government order, and he knew that if he did nothing, they would be destroyed by morning. He took 2 binders of documents and walked out of the bank. The next day, he handed them to a Jewish organization in Zurich. Within 48 hours, the story exploded across international media. The bank fired Meili. Swiss authorities investigated him for violating bank secrecy laws, treating him, a whistleblower, as a criminal. But the damage to the bank's reputation was irreversible. Suddenly, the world was asking how many other records had been destroyed, how much money was still sitting in dormant accounts, and why had the banks fought so hard, for so long, to keep survivors from reclaiming what was theirs. One survivor, interviewed after the scandal broke, said, "For 50 years, they told us we had no proof. Now we know why. They were shredding the proof." International pressure and the 1998 settlement, the Meili revelations triggered a cascade of investigations. The US Senate held hearings. The World Jewish Congress launched a public campaign. Survivor groups filed class action lawsuits. And the Swiss government, facing the threat of economic sanctions and a full boycott of Swiss banks in the United States, finally agreed to act. In 1998, after intense negotiations, Credit Suisse and UBS agreed to a settlement, $1.25 billion, to be distributed to Holocaust survivors and heirs who could prove they had claims to dormant accounts, looted assets, or slave labor tied to Swiss-held funds. It was the largest Holocaust restitution settlement in history, but it was also deeply controversial. Survivor groups pointed out that $1.25 billion was a fraction of what had actually been stolen. Economists estimated that the real value of dormant Jewish accounts alone, adjusted for inflation and interest, could be $20 billion or more. The banks admitted no wrongdoing. They framed the settlement as a humanitarian gesture, not an acknowledgement of theft. And the process of claiming money from the settlement was agonizing. Survivors had to fill out forms, provide evidence, and wait, sometimes years, for a decision. Many were elderly, sick, or living in poverty. Some died before their claims were processed. One widow, whose husband had spent his final years trying to prove his family had owned a textile business in Vienna, received a check for $800 decades after the claim was filed, years after her husband's death. She told a reporter, "This isn't justice. This is a receipt for what they stole." But for others, even small payments carried symbolic weight. One survivor said, "It's not about the money. It's about the bank finally admitting, yes, your family existed. Yes, something was taken from you. Yes, we remember." The fight for looted art. While the Swiss bank scandal dominated headlines, another battle was unfolding in museums, auction houses, and private collections around the world. Thousands of artworks, paintings, sculptures, rare books had been looted by the Nazis or sold under duress by Jewish families fleeing persecution. After the war, many of these pieces ended up in prestigious museums or the hands of wealthy collectors, often with no questions asked about their origins. For decades, families searching for lost heirlooms faced impossible obstacles. Museums claimed good faith purchases. Auction houses said they had no obligation to investigate provenance beyond a certain point. And even when families could prove ownership, statutes of limitations in many countries barred legal action. But in the 1990s and 2000s, a few landmark cases broke through, and they were messy, painful, and revealing. The case of Gustav Klimt's portrait of Adele Bloch Bauer won. This golden masterpiece had belonged to a wealthy Jewish family in Vienna. After the Nazis seized it, the painting ended up in the Austrian State Gallery, where it became a national icon. In 1998, Maria Altmann, niece of the original owner and a survivor herself, filed suit to reclaim the painting. The Austrian government fought her for years, arguing the painting was part of Austria's cultural heritage and that Altmann had no legal right to it. The case went all the way to the US Supreme Court. In 2006, 8 years after the lawsuit began, Altmann won. The painting was returned to her. She later sold it for $135 million, making it one of the most expensive paintings ever sold at the time. But Altmann was in her 80s when she won. She had spent most of her life knowing her family's treasure hung in a museum, untouchable. When asked how it felt to finally hold the painting's ownership, she said, "It's bittersweet. My aunt never saw this. My parents never saw this. I won, but I won alone." The case of the Guelph Treasure, a collection of medieval relics sold by a consortium of German Jewish art dealers in 1935 under Nazi pressure for a fraction of their value. The heirs sued in 2014, demanding the return of the artifacts from a Berlin museum. The case dragged through German and US courts for years. In 2021, a US appeals court ruled that the case could not proceed under American law, effectively ending the heirs' chances of restitution. One of the heirs, speaking to reporters after the ruling, said, "We showed the documents, we showed the coercion, we showed everything, and they still said no. That's what justice looks like for us." These cases reveal an uncomfortable truth. Even when families have proof, even when the theft is documented, the legal and political will to return looted property is inconsistent, expensive, and agonizingly slow. The practical nightmare, destroyed records, and legal mazes. One of the cruelest aspects of seeking restitution is how much of it depends on evidence that no longer exists or was deliberately destroyed. Bank records were shredded, as Christoph Meili revealed. Property deeds were burned in bombings or confiscated by post-war communist governments. Insurance policies were invalidated under laws written by the Nazis themselves. And witnesses, those who could verify ownership, family ties, or transactions, were murdered. Survivors and their heirs are often asked to provide documentation that would have been nearly impossible to preserve even under normal circumstances, let alone during genocide. Birth certificates from towns that no longer exist, contracts written in languages the survivors don't speak, photographs of possessions that were taken when cameras were rare and expensive. And even when families managed to assemble evidence, they face legal systems designed to protect current owners. Many countries have statutes of limitations that bar claims filed decades after the original theft. Courts ask, why did you wait so long? The answer, because I was hiding, fleeing, or trying to survive, often isn't enough. One lawyer who has worked on dozens of restitution cases described the process bluntly. You're asking an 85-year-old Holocaust survivor to prove something that happened when she was 5, using documents that were destroyed 70 years ago, in a legal system that assumes she's lying unless she can prove otherwise. It's not designed for justice. It's designed to say no. Voices of the survivors and heirs. Behind every claim, every lawsuit, every denied settlement is a human being, someone who remembers. Renee. In her 90s, when her claim was finally processed, Renee had spent decades trying to reclaim her family's jewelry store in Prague. The Nazis seized it in 1939. After the war, the communist government nationalized it. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, she filed a claim with the new Czech Restitution Commission. She received a settlement equivalent to $12,000, far less than the store's value, but more than she ever expected. She told an interviewer, "I don't need the money. I needed them to say, 'Your father owned this. It was stolen. We're sorry.' They never said sorry, but at least they said he existed." David, the grandson of a German Jewish lawyer whose art collection was sold at auction under duress in 1938. David spent 15 years researching provenance, tracking pieces through auction records, museums, and private sales. He located 3 paintings. One was returned voluntarily by a collector who believed it was the right thing to do. The second he recovered through a lawsuit after 5 years of litigation. The third remains in a museum that refuses to return it, citing a legal technicality. David said, "I've spent more money on lawyers than the paintings are worth. But this isn't about money. It's about my grandfather's name. It's about saying, you can't just erase us." Sarah, a survivor herself, Sarah tried for 20 years to reclaim her mother's life insurance policy, issued by a German company before the war. The company insisted the policy had lapsed due to non-payment, even though her mother had been arrested and deported before any payment was due. In 2001, an international commission ruled in Sarah's favor and awarded her a settlement of $3,500. She died 2 years later. Her daughter said she fought for that money not because she needed it, but because she needed to win. Just once, she needed to win. International commissions and their limits. In response to mounting pressure, several countries and organizations established restitution commissions and funds in the 1990s and 2000s. Germany created funds to compensate former slave laborers. Austria set up a commission to review art claims. The International Commission on Holocaust-Era Insurance Claims, ICHEIC, was launched to process insurance policy claims. These efforts helped. Thousands of survivors received some form of compensation, but the systems were also flawed, underfunded, and overwhelmed. Processing a single claim could take years. Standards of proof varied wildly, and in many cases the amounts paid bore no relationship to the actual value of what had been stolen. ICHEIC, for example, shut down in 2007 after distributing only a fraction of the money it had collected, amid accusations of mismanagement and excessive administrative costs. One critic called it a second theft, this time by bureaucracy, and fundamentally no commission could solve the core problem. Most victims were dead. Most evidence was gone. And no amount of money could bring back what had truly been lost: family, home, and a world that no longer existed. Memory versus money. What justice really means. There's a question that haunts every restitution case. Can money ever be justice? Survivors and their families are divided on this. Some say yes. Financial compensation is a tangible acknowledgement of harm, and it can provide dignity and security in old age. Others say no, money is a poor substitute for stolen lives, and the legal battles themselves are re-traumatizing. But almost everyone agrees on one thing: the fight for restitution is not primarily about wealth, it's about memory. It's about forcing institutions, banks, museums, governments to confront what they did or what they allowed to happen. It's about saying out loud and on the record, this was wrong, this family existed, this loss was real. One Holocaust educator put it this way: when a survivor wins a restitution case, they're not just getting money or property back, they're getting proof that history hasn't forgotten them. In a world that tried to erase them completely, that proof is sacred. But there's also a bitter reality: justice delayed is often justice denied. Most Holocaust survivors are gone now. The children and grandchildren who continue these fights are pursuing claims for people they never met, based on stories passed down, photographs fading in albums, and a deep generational sense that something must be reclaimed. If not the object itself, then at least the truth of its loss. The unfinished work. Today, restitution battles continue. Museums still hold looted art. Bank vaults still contain assets whose owners were murdered. And every year, a few more cases are resolved. Some with returns, some with settlements, and many with nothing at all. In 2020, the heirs of a Jewish art dealer recovered a painting from a German museum after a 7-year legal fight. In 2021, a different family lost their claim to a masterpiece hanging in a Dutch collection, when a court ruled that too much time had passed. In 2023, Switzerland announced a new investigation into dormant accounts, another round of searching for money that survivors insisted was there all along. The work is far from over, but time is running out. The last survivors are in their 90s and 100s. Soon, there will be no living witnesses left, only descendants, documents, and the question of whether we, as a society, care enough to finish what was started too late. What true justice would look like. I want you to think about something. Imagine your family's home was seized, your parents were killed, everything you owned, photos, furniture, heirlooms, money, was taken. You survive somehow and spend the next 50 years trying to prove it all existed. You finally win a court case. When you're 85 years old, you get a check for $5,000 and a letter that says, "We acknowledge your claim." Would that feel like justice? For some, the answer is yes, because acknowledgement, however small, is better than silence. For others, the answer is no, because no amount of money can replace what was lost, and the fight itself is exhausting, humiliating, and often fruitless. But here's what I think. Justice isn't just about the outcome. It's about the process. It's about whether we, as a society, make it easy or hard for victims to be heard. It's about whether we protect institutions that profited from genocide or whether we hold them accountable. It's about whether we destroy records or preserve them, whether we say, "Prove it," or "We believe you." And by that measure, we've failed far more often than we've succeeded. Closing questions and call to action. Many of you have written to tell me that these stories of money, art, and legal battles matter because they show that the war didn't end in 1945. It kept going, quietly, in courtrooms and archives, fought by survivors who had every reason to give up but didn't. But I want to ask you, first, do you think $1.25 billion, or any amount of money, can ever truly compensate for what was stolen during the Holocaust? Or is financial restitution just a symbol? And if so, is that symbol enough? Second, if you were a museum director and discovered a painting in your collection had been looted from a Jewish family, would you return it voluntarily, even if the law didn't require it? What would guide your decision? And third, why do you think it took 50 years for the world to seriously address Nazi gold and looted assets? What does that delay tell us about how we treat victims of atrocities? Leave a comment, share your thoughts, And if this story challenged you, if it made you think about justice in a different way, share this video, subscribe. Because the stories that make us uncomfortable, the ones that ask hard questions and don't offer easy answers, are the ones we need most. The fight for Nazi-era restitution is still happening. The survivors are almost gone, but their children and grandchildren are still in courtrooms, still searching archives, still asking for what was taken. And whether they win or lose, their fight is a reminder. History isn't just what happened, it's what we choose to remember.